Friends! Tell your friends about Hooks and Ladders, but also about songstudio.ca. You can get all kinds of information about songwriting, tips, and all kinds of stuff. Anyway, like, follow, and subscribe. That's what we need. That's what you need.
Here's another peek at what we did at SongStudio Online last August. Hope you enjoy.
So, Dan, I want to know, I know some of this myself, so it'll be, but don't hold back because you know that I know some of your background. I'd love to hear about what got you into songwriting in the first place. Where did it all start for you?
Well, I was just totally a slave for music from the moment I was born. So I was pretty much addicted to music to such an extent that my parents thought there must be something wrong with me. So it was like I had no choice but to write songs. Fortunately for me, I started studying classical guitar as a young boy, and that really, really helped, and then I guess by the time I was around 11, I started writing songs. And at that time, at 11, you're not supposed to write about girls because they think you're sucky. So I was writing love songs about my cat, which deeply distressed my dad. He thought that meant I really had a problem. So they just started pouring out of me, and I didn't think of it as anything special or unusual. It just seemed like I had to do that just as I had to breathe.
In what way do you think the classical guitar playing was helpful to you? I mean, and does it continue to be helpful to you?
Well, good question, Blair. The great thing was that I learned all kinds of interesting chord progressions that were classically influenced, so that when I started to write songs, I was able to implement some of those more classically informed chord progressions into writing, for example, more like pop songs, and it made the chordal structures of my songs a little bit more unique. So, and I've always felt that the more instruments you play, the easier it is to write, particularly writing music and melodies. So it was just a fantastic foray into writing my own songs, from learning all these preludes and etudes and things like that.
And you recognized some of that stuff in the pop music you were listening to? Were there songs where you thought, hey, that's like such and such?
Well, I would often listen to more complicated chords by musicians like Bruce Cockburn, who obviously had very, very progressive and intricate and unusual chord progression. So I would kind of affix myself to those kind of songs. So the combination between learning Cockburn's chord progressions, which are right off the wall, to my classically informed chord progressions, informed me to then incorporate all these different influences into the songs that I ultimately started writing.
Right, that makes sense. I always think of you and Bruce Cockburn as contemporaries, but actually he's older than you. And was he established already when you started?
Yeah, actually we were signed to the same management company,
right,
in 1975. So I think his first album came out in 1970. So I would have been maybe 16. So I was into Cockburn before his first album came out, because he actually performed at my high school in an English class, maybe when I was 15, before he'd released any record. So I was into him right from the beginning. So yeah, I would say he's maybe, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years older than I, but naturally I got to know him pretty well since we were managed by the same people. And the music business in Toronto in the 70s, or in Canada, was very, very small and insular. So you pretty well got to know everybody else who was involved in making records at that time.
Right. And as you say, particularly if you're managed by the same management company. Yeah. And when you were starting at this point, were you still living in Don Mills, or had you moved out of your parents' house?
Well, I signed with RCA Records as a singer-songwriter when I was 18. And at that point, my dad was so angry that I chose to pursue music as opposed to going to university, that we weren't talking. So I was living on my own. I was working for the civil service for $1.89 an hour. I was already starting to get international interest in my songwriting. So the word on the street was that I was going to be a successful songwriter, but not maybe a successful artist. So by 72, signed to RCA, that was when I was absolutely, completely, involved in trying to make it as a professional musician. That being said, it took me a couple of years before I could just do music.
Right. I see. I remember an article about you when I was, I think I'm just a few years younger than you. And I remember an article in the Weekend Saturday Star magazine that predicted that you were going to be a star. And I remember thinking, who?
Yeah.
This guy from Don Mills, like where I'm from? No. And being quite skeptical, but then seeing you were doing a week at the Riverboat and other places, where the real deal made music, and thinking, okay, I guess he's the real deal. It was long before I actually heard you. I think I first heard you on the radio, in fact, and I think the song was "Hold On." Is that?
Well, thank you for remembering that song. My first radio hit in Canada was "You Make Me Want to Be a Father," which came out in 1975. But
Right.
back to places to play, like the Riverboat. The great thing about Toronto at that time was there are so many places you could perform. There's a great coffee house called Grumbles, which would one week have a duo of Jim Croce and Randy Newman for a week. There was probably about 15 different places where I could go to audition to perform. So it was a fantastic time to be a singer-songwriter in North America. There was a virtual explosion of singer-songwriters. So it was a very, very, significant time for me. And as you recall, Blair, back then, being a pop singer or songwriter was just not a career option. Nowadays with all these TV shows like, The Voice or something, everybody feels they could be a pop singer. But back then, I didn't know anybody that I grew up with that wanted to do that. That was about as bizarre as saying you were going to be a circus performer and get shot out of a cannon, which again kind of worked to my advantage because there just wasn't the same kind of competition back then because it just wasn't a natural job option.
I think as well, parents now think of being a pop singer or a songwriter, a professional performer, as a viable career option, and they send their kids to schools like the one I teach at, Seneca College, but also Humber College, and all the various programs all over the place. And I don't know if that's wise necessarily, because as you say, it increases the competition. On the other hand, it increases the level. The songwriting, it seems to me, in certain circles anyway, is at a really high level right now, as is guitar playing. People who can really play. My son started playing 2 years ago, and he can play better than me in a lot of ways. Maybe not in some key ways yet, but he's getting there. And I think this is. It's raising the state of the art in a way, but it's also making it much, much more competitive than it used to be.
And as we know, competition is a good thing, because the whole thing about the Stones and the Beatles, or the Beach Boys and the Beatles, that they were, the Beatles, Beach Boys would put up Pet Sounds, and the Beatles would be freaked out, and then they would make Rubber Soul or Sgt. Pepper. So that competition really, really pushes you to up your game.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting though. You said your dad was so angry with you for choosing music, and again, in a modern world, your dad might be paying tuition for you to go to, one of the accredited schools and so forth. So it's interesting that that you went against your father's wishes, which of course you write about in your book. It's a terrific book, by the way. I'm my father's son. But you write about that. I just think it's just a comment on how things have changed, and the bravery I think it took you to do what you did, to go down that path. Did it feel foolish at any point? Did you feel like, oh man, I've made a mistake?
No, I never did. No,
that's amazing.
My dad was probably the most confident human being I've ever known, and so I think between my DNA and watching the way my dad interacted in the world, I was born like a very, very confident kid. So there was never a second where I didn't think I was not going to be a success. And I knew that my dad really just didn't understand that kind of music. He was into, he only loved black jazz music, right? And so I kind of knew, even when he was telling me I was going to be a failure, that as a PhD sociologist, that he was sort of out of his element, that he knew as much about music as I knew about sociology. So somehow I was able to dismiss his put downs. It didn't really affect my confidence at all.
That's amazing. That's really that does say something about your self-confidence, and you know that your parents did a great job in raising you because you had that self-possession to continue on. You mentioned the Beatles and the Beach Boys and the Rolling Stones and so forth. Was that stuff influencing you at an early age, or you know, how influential were each of those as an example?
Well, I was like, just like you, like all of us, I was influenced by so many different genres of music.
Yeah.
You know, again, the first music I was ever, we're usually exposed to first to the music our parents listened to,
Yeah.
or older siblings listened to. Well, because I'm the eldest of three, it was my parents' music. So my dad loved Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Sarah Vaughan, Billie Holiday. So did I. I loved that music. When I got exposed to pop music, well, you know, I was exposed to the Beatles first and foremost, but then I got really into people like, everything that was coming out of Motown. So I was really blown away by the R&B stuff, Smokey Robinson, for example, or later on Stevie Wonder, as well as being blown away by the Beatles or the Stones or Led Zeppelin. So, you know, I remember spending all the money I had to buy a Beatles songbook. And at the time, I can't remember how expensive it was. It might have been $6, which is a lot of money when you're a little kid. And it was every song that they pretty much had written, or so the book claimed. So I just locked myself in my room and taught myself by all those little chord diagrams on top of the lyrics how to play all these songs. So I think, again, it was the combination of all these different musical influences that then informed the way I started writing my own songs. There was a high emotionality when it came to Black musicians due to obviously the traumas of growing up Black. So that high emotionality that came through, say, in a song like Bill Withers' Use Me, you know, I think that had a huge impact on how I turned to being very, very emotional as a songwriter.
Yeah, you certainly are. There's your songs are really open and like emotionally open in a way that is still unusual, I think, and a huge they make your songs your songwriting in general very appealing to me because I love that kind of emotionality. It though it doesn't your songwriting in general isn't doesn't seem concerned with style. Not to say they're not stylish. I don't mean that. I just mean in terms of, you know, the ephemeral way that things change in terms of musical fashion or production styles or whatever. You seem to have locked into something and then stuck with it because it was working for you. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it just seemed to me like the very natural way to write songs. It was never an analytical or calculating process. They just, as they did then and as they do now, they kind of sort of flowed out of me. I almost had no control over them. The only difference now probably is I'm much more of a thorough rewriter. Whereas when I started writing songs, you know, whatever came out, and I didn't change anything. So, but I still feel that they're coming from basically the same place.
That's interesting, and very interesting about the rewriting, because I think that's the thing that many of us who continue to write songs as we get older learn is, you know, the rewriting process, which can be painful and can be more work in some ways than the original, you know, expression, is really important. It's really crucial. It's funny though that when we're young, like I shared that tendency, and I didn't have your self-confidence. I have to say, I don't think, but the kind of confidence that you have to have when you write a song to then, you know, think, all right, that's done, and now I'm going to play it for people. I had that too, and if somebody said, yeah, but you know, this second verse, you really should, you know, do something about that, I'd be like, no, this is how it came out of me, almost as if it's precious gold or something and mustn't be touched.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you, as a guy who's so self-confident and who had, you know, positive feedback with your career and with your songs, how do you come to the realization that, yeah, actually, you know what, I should be rewriting some of these, this could be better?
Well, I think what the huge, you know, seismic change for me was when I started writing, I'd always just written songs for myself. Again, coming out of the tradition of, say, Joni Mitchell or Gordon Lightfoot or Neil Young, they were solo songwriters. And so that's what I saw myself, or Cat Stevens, for example. So I sort of saw myself in that tradition. And then suddenly I was thrown together with Barry Mann when I was 22, who's co-written the most played song of all time, You've Lost That Love and Feeling, as well as on Broadway and Kicks. And it was through writing, sometimes when I touched with Barry Mann, that I was then opened up to a whole new kind of songwriter I'd never seen before. And writing with Barry, I had to go through an awful lot of rewrites. And then from Barry Mann, I went to Michael Masser, who probably wrote and produced more hit songs for Black artists and groups as a Caucasian Jew from Philadelphia than anybody else in the 80s. And so writing, for example, In Your Eyes with Michael Masser, that ended up being cut and became a hit for George Benson. There were so many rewrites involved in that song, so many rewrites in songs I co-wrote with Barry Mann, that's when there was this huge shift where I took all my original influences, and then I was literally going to the songwriting university, writing with Barry Mann and Michael Masser. The joke now is if I can't write a great song now, after that kind of exposure and training, I don't deserve to call myself a songwriter.
Thanks for taking a glimpse with us inside the SongStudio workshop from last August. Stay tuned for more.